Hello, I'm Rob Byrne and I'm the Project Manager for the Pasture for Life Farming and Protected Landscapes project covering Nidderdale, the North Pennines, Forest of Bowland, the Lake District and the Yorkshire Dales. Today we're over in the Yorkshire Dales at Talfit Farm exploring the topic of integrating livestock with trees. Our event today has been developed in partnership with Ian Bell from Northern Soil Regen. It was his idea to set this event up. He's been working on this farm for numerous years, building the project up here, and we're delighted to spend our time exploring integrating livestock with trees.
I set up NS Regen, Northern Soil Regen, 5-6 years ago. We've been providing regenerative farming advice to people in the area and slightly further afield, from soil health, grazing management, bit on agroforestry as well. We were engaged by Oliver Leatham in late 2021 to come and have a look at the farm here and just discuss with them how they could transition from a conventional farming system to a regenerative one. A little bit on the background of the farm. The Leathams bought it, I think, somewhere around 2017-18. Ian would maybe correct me, but roughly in that period. And day-to-day basis, Ian, who's kindly helping on the coffee and lunch, runs it on and manages the farm. Oliver and his son Ben are quite heavily involved. They live down in Labour. Historically, it's run a flock of Swaledale ewes and commercial suckler cows. And as I said, we started in late 2021. And then what we sort of suggested then was a holistic approach, looking right across the whole farm, integrating lots of different methods. But a real integral part of that being agroforestry. And given the amount of time it takes trees to grow, the best time to plant that tree is yesterday, and that was one of the things we started working on fairly early doors. So our primary objectives, and when we discussed this with Leathams and Oliver in the first place, was getting away from this sort of polarised, it has to be trees or it has to be grass, and explaining that the two together, 1 + 1 = 3. And there's a lot we can do by integrating the two together. And we really came at it from a farm productivity focus. So as we go through, the aim was to create a system of planting that improved the farming system. And this is, I think, sort of find, when we're talking to farmers, is that if we focus on how we can improve the farming system, by putting planting schemes in that focus on that, oh, by the way, in the process of doing this, we suddenly get this really long list of other benefits that are going to come with that. The farm's going to become more resilient to climate change. We're going to improve financial sustainability, reducing fossil fuel inputs, possibly producing more nutritious, sustainable food. We can protect and cool water courses down. We can stop York flooding to a certain extent, or reduce the problem by keeping water in the landscape, repairing landscape function. We can provide corridors for wildlife, increase biodiversity, an enriched farm environment, contribute to carbon sequestration. And one area that we might be able to look at, we need to get some data whether there is lead problems on the farm here, but the willows that we talked about earlier as dynamic accumulators, if they can be used in areas where we've got leaching of lead, there is some evidence out there that willow can help sort of reduce that runoff into the watercourses. So what methods did we consider? So wood pasture, new hedges, using 5 metre sort of wider shelter strips and wide hedges wherever possible, narrow strips of fodder trees, shelter belts, potential future woodland bounds, keyline planting, which is planting trees along the contour to try and reduce the speed of water runs down the slope. for me, the important thing is this, we're combining trees and farming together, and it's that 1 + 1 is going to equal 3 here. We've got to shelter all those benefits from farming, which I think will make a massive change in terms of how we can manage the farm here, or how Ian and the Labour's manage the farm. But there's a massive amount of biodiversity and ecological benefits should come from this. And hopefully it's just phase 1 of what could be a bigger project if phase 2 gets approved in the future.
I'm an agroforestry advisor, so it's very much trees on farms. That's my focus. I cover the whole of the UK, which I know sounds ridiculous, and it is ridiculous at times, if that makes sense. I'm based down in Bath, lots of travel, but I guess the benefit of that allows me to see everything that's happening everywhere, and I guess that's strongly linked to grants and the grant support that different farmers, different countries have, and I can definitely see the positives in in everything. In my context today, though, I want to talk as if just as broadly as can. Trees on farms, properly integrated, so within the farming system, actively managed. That's really important. It's something that often isn't talked about. For them to really work, sometimes you have to cut trees down, and it might not be a popular thing necessarily to say, but that management is really important. Again, moving beyond that mindset of just planting. Really important to plant now, but at the same time, equally as important to make sure that the trees deliver value. And if that means chopping them down, coppicing, things like this, then we need to get behind people doing that. Trying to link how farmers and landowners view their treescape through the eyes of their business objectives. So how can we get the treescape to support farmers to reach their business objectives, whether that's reducing costs, lowering stock, things like this. So again, as a starting point, very much take a step back and think, what am I trying to achieve by planting these trees? And the best person to do that is often the farmer themselves. We have a fantastic resource in the forestry sector in terms of advice and support for planting and potentially integrating trees onto farms, but perhaps they don't fully understand farming. So to avoid there's no disconnect between those two, it's really important to as a farmer to make sure that your trees are really going to work for you, obviously in the short term, long term, and beyond. So again, hedges, shelter belts, isolated infield trees, farm woodland, orchards, perhaps not up here, maybe riparian woodlands. It's very much linking your treescape with the business objectives and being clear on your objectives to achieve through your tree planting is critical. It's not that it could ruin a farm. I don't think. I think largely tree planting is a positive thing. I guess I view it from maybe a missed opportunity element, that if you designed a type of agroforestry or something like that, you speak to farmers, they've planted, or they've come across the idea of silver pasture or planting trees for specific reasons of their farm, and actually maybe even as short as 2 or 3 years down the line, the objective of that planting has changed completely. For example, they might have planted because they wanted to increase biodiversity, something like that, and all of a sudden they then see a noticeable difference for water quality or different elements like that. So it's before anything's planted or even designed, it's really figuring out what you want from these systems, and again, you as farmers are the best people to drill down on that. What have we got here? Yeah, so systems that can reduce livestock housing costs, shortening that period of winter housing. Also, farmers here, it's a big picture of a big pile of wood chip, not very clear, but there's a farmer down in Wiltshire area, and he, perhaps 4 or 5 years ago, moved to bedding his cattle on wood chip. And there's been a fair bit of research in Wales about it all, and it largely proves that the cost. He's now got to the stage where wood chip's really expensive, you know, and actually he was doing it to incorporate his straw back into, it's a mixed farm, straw back into the soil, but now all of a sudden he's come up against a bit of an issue with the cost of wood chip as that's increased. So how can he plant a system that will deliver that requirement of wood chip? And you can see by the pile, it's a huge amount of wood chip that he needs. Sort of aside, you can reuse wood chip. So often you don't clear the sheds out every year. You'll take the top layer off, or you'll mix it round, and that compostability, it composts over the summer, and actually you can then reuse that, whether you top dress it with straw or put some more wood chip on top. So different ways of doing it. For those that are interested, professor called Tim Pagella, he's at Bangor University. He's a professor in agroforestry. He talked about the urgency required in adopting agroforestry, but this is for the southeast, so Kent and places like that. And he's saying that the models are suggesting within 10 years large areas of the southeast becoming unfarmable because of the risk of drought. And it's really important, that word risk within this. It's not necessarily that you can't deal with the weather, but if you have 2 or 3 years of really severe weather or uncertain weather, it really makes it unviable to invest in farming businesses and things like that. So he's pitching this idea that trees can really help that by providing shade for crops and things like that. I don't know what the models say for this area. Definitely worth listening to the advice, so seeking that from local organisations and things like that, if people do have that sort of information, local universities and things potentially, and aligning your farming business to cope with these worst case scenarios now. Otherwise, it will get difficult. Hate to be alarmist, but I think it's true to have this conversation and make people think about it. Shelter from bad weather. I see a lot of interest from farmers, particularly sheep farmers, this idea of hypothermia, caring for newborn lambs through shelter and shade, and then also reducing mastitis and things like that. Storm events happening and that greater uncertainty. I guess March used to be a safe time to lamb your sheep. Now, who knows? Thought leader in this area is definitely Dr. Lindsay Wistance from the Organic Research Centre. So lots of what I talk about now is stuff that I've heard her talk about, and she's done a few podcasts and things like that. Definitely seek her out if this is the sort of area that you're really interested in. She specialises in animal welfare, but through the lens of silvopasture and incorporating trees, things like that. So, Dr. Lindsay Wistance, if anyone's interested. I just introduced the idea of this lower critical temperature. So the idea that for every 1 degree under this temperature, the animal requires 2% more feed to maintain condition or maintain growth. So it's sort of the key temperature at which animals are comfortable, potentially. And that varies hugely with breed, with condition, with food, access to food that they've got. And also things like coat colour and stuff like that. It all plays its part. Small changes in microclimates can make a really large difference. So it's really difficult. All trees are different, all landscapes are different, weather's different, things like that. But you could be looking as much as 70% reduction in wind speeds from incorporating trees into your systems, which is a huge help when you're thinking about wind chill factor and elements like that. Yeah, as well as slowing the flow of water. Rain plays a big part in the idea of a lower critical temperature. As wet animals, their lower critical temperature shoots up. So if we can keep our animals drier, shelter from rain, things like that, that helps hugely. And I've got here, I sort of did a bit of research. This was forestry research, so the research element of Forestry Commission. It's quite old, and it's focused on woodlands, so not individual trees. But I was trying to get my head around how does how does it work, a big tree versus a sort of woodland structure. But you're looking at sort of 10 to 25% annual rainfall, so evaporated from a tree, with the idea that, and then for conifer plantations, even more, so 25 to 45%. So the idea that the tree intercepts the rain, and then the rain will evaporate back off the tree rather than ever reaching the ground. And if you add in the sort of transpiration element, so the tree sucking up moisture and being able to then disperse it, rather than it flowing through the landscape from a sort of rainfall, sort of peak rainfall perspective and flooding and things like that, that conifer plantation could be as much as 80% of the water that falls as rainfall is re-evaporated and lost. So huge figures. Definitely an area I'm really interested in is that sort of natural flood management element, and how trees can benefit, and how then farmers can benefit from incorporating trees in steep places and things like that, I guess can deliver them for people downstream, and how we sort of frame that narrative. And then my last point is this idea that livestock will naturally seek shelter, which is really important. You're not forcing them in terms of animal welfare or anything like that. You're not forcing them to do this. If you provide, then they will seek, and that's very helpful, I think. So there's a jumble of numbers here, but I'll run through it all. So this sort of hypothetical temperature situation, we've got a tolerant breed, so healthy beef animal, maybe native breed. Its sort of lower critical temperature is around 0 degrees. That's sort of where it's happy, and under that, obviously, there's then an increase in food needing to maintain condition. So that's sort of where we're looking at. So this is an animal in good condition, good winter coat. So we're looking at plus 2 degrees air temperature outside. It's a bit warmer today, but with a steady breeze, about 15 miles an hour. This drops that temperature, I never know what to call it, but that feels like temperature, wind chill factor, down to -7 degrees. So straight away, with that healthy beef animal, you're looking at 14% more food to maintain condition. But this is dry, remember. So add rain into the mix. The animal's lower critical temperature shoots up to 15 degrees centigrade. So when that animal is wet, its lower critical temperature is now not from 0 up to 15. The difference between -7, that wind chill factor temperature, and the 15 degrees is 22 degrees. So we're looking at 44% extra food to maintain condition. Obviously, these come through in spells. You might have a couple of days of this to show you what we're talking about. And you might say, that's fine, I've got the food to feed them. But it's obviously a reduction in food conversion ratio, so the performance of that animal is going down. It's also a reduction in animal welfare. So moving then into a benefit of trying to avoid heat stress. So again, Lindsay Wistance does a lot of research in this. Definitely seek her out for more information and things. But she always says heat stress is potentially much more damaging to livestock than exposure to cold and wet conditions. So from a lower critical temperature, we then move to an upper critical temperature, and it varies by species, breeds, body condition, coat colour, energy content of feed and things like that. Heat stress, basically, animals shut down then what the class as non-vital systems by moving, so they move blood away from their internal organs to their skin to be able to dissipate heat, basically. You'll find out that these are fertility, growth as well, so arguably not non-vital really, but that's sort of where it is. Livestock can recover quite quickly, but rely on cooler periods during the day. So it's not your peak midday temperatures that you need to worry about. It's that ambient temperature over 24 hours. So it's really important that we have cold or cooler overnight temperatures to allow that animal to dissipate heat properly. It's not necessarily the sort of peak temperatures that we're worried about. And again, livestock will naturally seek shade. It shouldn't be an uphill battle if you provide them with that option. This is Lochgall Research Station in Northern Ireland. So this is a 30-year-old ash silver pasture sort of plot, and they've been monitoring it versus, so half the field was split. It was planted with ash and sycamore, but I think the sycamore failed quickly. It was part of a UK, I think there were 8 trials around the UK. I think this might be the last one potentially left now. But they've managed it, and they've monitored it, and they've done loads of research on it, and fantastic results coming out. So that, as you can see, that they're actively cutting trees down to maintain that canopy level, that shade level, and they've sort of plotted that as the trees grow, the grass dips off. So how can we manage it to try and produce benefit? The Barbers up in Perthshire, organic beef and sheep farm. They're supplying Waitrose, so they sell fat lambs and they sell beef for finishing, basically, to someone else. But again, all into Waitrose. It's a family farm, very much so. So husband and wife, I think they've now sort of semi-retired from the farm, and daughter is running it. But they embraced trees and the benefit trees could have on their farm. Typical, quite high grass. Grass is quite slow to get going in the spring and things like that. Obviously, quite large areas, sort of split between moorland and more improved pasture, but not sort of, intensive grassland or anything like that. We're saying Andrew has a background in forestry, which is a huge leg up in terms of understanding the benefits trees could potentially deliver. So I guess that's perhaps where he came from, and from a pioneering position, I guess that's how he saw it. But importantly to his journey, and he definitely talks about it being a journey, is that his uncle, who ran the farm before him, planted some shelter belts, very typical shelter belts, for stock cover, and Andrew observed the stock using them at night. So the fences came down as they do, and the livestock obviously had access to them. And initially they said they never saw any interaction at all, but actually so that they're very interested in ecology, and so they had like nighttime cameras, and they were trying to trap something else, and all of a sudden they saw their cows in the middle of their woodland, and they couldn't believe it. But it turned out that after dark the cows would then use the shelter of the woodland, and it was sort of a tweaking moment. So what they did, they've done lots of different elements, and you can see this is sort of a wood pasture block, and there's some really good photos. He's actually features on a video that the Soil Association did about agroforestry in the uplands a few years ago. Find it on YouTube, and they interview him there. But he planted these blocks of trees, and this was pre any agroforestry support, even the idea of agroforestry. It was very much how could it fit within the Scottish forestry grant support system. So the alleys, the wide grass alleys, was really important, because he was always planning to reintegrate livestock back within this system when he could. And he had his background in forestry, and so he knew about the grant support system. For some reason, they fell out of the grant support system for Scottish, for the agricultural element of it, and it was a sort of disaster, but they managed to do this sort of short-term, see them over. This is now so crucial to their business. So they now use this as their lambing field, basically. So it produces grass earlier in the season because of that microclimate the trees can produce, which is invaluable at that sort of the height at which he's farming at. You can see they're now starting to manage it. So again, talk about that, coppicing, sort of half pollarding here, perhaps not high enough for a pollard, but a lazy pollard, I think he likes to call it, chainsaw height. So he's now sort of re-looked at all his toll farming system. So he planted the wood pasture, and actually it was an income that he was short of initially, but actually it's integrated into his business really well, and now it's really important to him. He's actually now able to massively reduce their stocking rates, because they could move to a fat lamb. So finishing lambs rather than selling for fat, and that's made a huge difference. He's not pushing the whole system really hard, which he was when he first started, in terms of reducing worm burden, everything like that. And it's all back to this idea of having enough shelter within the system to be able to run a fatter lamb. He's now moved on to bedding on wood chip, so he's actually bought a wood chipper. And again, we've talked about it before, but it was very much about the risk of not being able to supply straw. He always says it never happened, it was always really expensive, but there's a risk being so far north that you couldn't get that straw. And to him, that business risk was too big. So he's now started looking at wood chip bedding, and he's involved in an innovative farmers trial looking at bokashi, so how they can hot compost that wood chip to spread onto their fields as well. So he talks about it really well. He said that all of a sudden, as he views his farm, he sees corners of fields that are scrub or, you know, old coppice and things like that. All of a sudden there's a value to it. And so he's now increased planting on that, and they've started to be managed. And in terms of that management, he says it's hugely beneficial for biodiversity as well. You know, introducing this coppicing and pollarding and things like that, it kickstarts everything. But again, it's all been driven to produce that wood chip for his bedding. He's also bought a small mill here, and he's producing timber for local craftsmen and wood turning and things like that. I don't think it'll ever. I think it's a hobby, you know, but at the same time it contributes and it keeps him happy as well. He also built an education centre on site, and he's used a lot of his wood in that as well. So hopefully a good case study there.